Hi everyone. I want to ask you to pardon me during this video because I went and came down with a cold, so you will be hearing that. This is a video about survey design. So if you're designing a survey, there's probably only a couple of you. This is the video for you to watch. And during this video, you'll be jotting down questions that occur to you as being something that might go on a survey you would use. So the first question we have to ask is why survey research? What does survey research do? In contrast to interviews, surveys are tools that can efficiently collect information from a large group of people. They can also be used when it's not possible to observe behaviors. You can ask people to report on their behaviors, like, well, drug use is not something you'll probably be asking, but it might be something like teaching, the way people teach, or what they do at home, or their reading, or something like that. You can use survey data to compare groups. So any kind of mathematical or numerical comparison is more easily done with surveys, and to compare the relationships between variables. So you can look at, for example, the relationship between an intervention and a test score. However, there are also issues with collecting survey data as compared to interviews or other data. Number one, surveys are very broad. There's no real human interaction, and so the kinds of meaning that you can acquire through surveys are necessarily superficial and shallow. Survey administration can be troubling. Where do you give the survey? Do you send it out through the mail? Is it over the telephone? Um, do you give it to someone during a professional development and take time away from the professional development? Respondents can have sort of the issue of a socially desirable response, like they might be thinking, well, what does this person want to hear? And I often spend a lot of time talking to people about, please give me the real deal. They also may not want to take the survey and just carelessly fill it out. And I'm sure all of you have done the same thing, as have I. Then there's also can be issues with wording on the instrument, and that's what we're going to really focus on today, is at least we can try to deal with these issues carefully and have a well-worded survey. So in the Rhea and Parker book, the stages of survey research are laid out fairly clearly, but I want to reiterate, you'll want to first specify your research questions. It's very important, and check those with me. Then we go through and develop the instrument, which we'll talk about today. Establishing construct reliability and validity, you probably will not do. Selecting a sample, we'll have a video about how to do that, or we'll talk about it in class during 8084. And then, of course, you conduct and analyze the survey, which we will also cover in 808.4 and 808.5. So we'll go through each of these steps, and I will provide support for each of them if you are doing a survey. So first, I'd like you to do a little bit of thinking and writing. Think about your topic and particularly have your research question in front of you. If you were going to conduct a survey about this topic, what would you like to find out about? So jot down a list of several items. If there are larger categories, break them into smaller. So for example, instruction is a broad category. Are you interested in inquiry-based teaching methods? Are you interested in the theories that underlie instruction, right? So if you're interested in equitable bilingual instruction, what does that look like? What aspects of that are you interested in? If you're interested in teacher beliefs, what does that look like? Write down what aspects of teacher beliefs, or teacher beliefs about what. Most of those things you just jotted down are called constructs. A construct is the characteristic that is to be measured in any given survey instrument. And it's usually assessed through a set of questions. It could be something direct, like age, or indirect, like teacher science instructional practices, or organizational climate, or something like that. Very often it's theoretically based, like the idea of identity. So the constructs you're interested in could be behaviors, they could be opinions, feelings, they could be knowledge or perceptions, and they could be abstract concepts like capacity or climate. So think about what you wrote down that you wanted to know about and whether these are constructs in terms of like, are they behaviors? Are they opinions? Are they feelings? Are they knowledge? I bet that most of what you wrote down would fit in one of those categories. And of course, before you compose questions, think about your research questions. So, and also who you'll be asking to fill it out and how you will conduct your analysis of the results. So for example, Nancy's research question from at least last summer's class is the following. In what ways are teachers equipped to improve reading scores for non-traditional students who are not achieving English language proficiency? So Nancy's interested in this idea of how are they equipped, right? So she's going to have to dig into the literature regarding, well, what are some different ways they could be equipped? They maybe need to have knowledge. They maybe need to have curriculum. They maybe, so, are there external and internal components? Maybe some of it has to do with attitudes. Maybe some of it's external, like the way the classroom is laid out, or support from administrators. So really think about, if you were Nancy, what you're really interested in finding out about the ways teachers are equipped, and those become your constructs, all right? And it looks like this might be filled out by either teachers or principals. So how you word the question, or might be filled out by a TOSA. How you word the question is going to be related to who is you're asking to fill this out. And now conducting analysis is not something you've done before. So it is actually a reason for this pilot study, is that it's really hard to keep in mind how you're going to conduct an analysis of a survey if you have not ever done an analysis of a survey. So the great part is, since we will be conducting an analysis, when you go start on this for your dissertation, you will know what it means to conduct an analysis of the results and whether you should change the questions accordingly. So then there's the question of where you get your questions. You can, of course, come up with them on your own based on the literature. You can also conduct focus groups. This is a common way to come up with survey questions. You really, in conducting focus groups, you come to understand the variety of experiences people have in order to create survey questions that are accurate in their language. So for example, I may not actually know the range of resources a teacher might need to be equipped to teach bilingual education. So I might do a focus group of teachers, like, well, what kinds of things do you think are important to do excellent bilingual education? It also helps me get the language right. Maybe I'm not referring to something the way they refer to something. However, focus groups, of course, are time consuming. You may also use other people's surveys, and these questions have already been validated and tested. That's kind of nice. Unfortunately, they may not really be the right questions for your context or your research question. They may also lack elements of social justice. In other words, sometimes survey questions are extractive or implicate the respondent as not being a valuable person, and we really have to be careful of that. So these are just the pluses and minuses of using different kinds of survey tools. All right, for the next part of this presentation, I will get into writing actual survey questions. I really encourage you throughout this presentation to jot down as many ideas as occur to you to do survey questions. First, I want to start with you thinking about this example. Are there any issues with this example question that you can think of? Pause the video and think about this. So there are two basic types of questions. One is unstructured or open questions, where respondents can reply in their own words. You can really get at the meaning that people are trying to convey, but these are a lot less generalizable and very difficult to turn into numbers. So an example question is here. Please list the top 3 ways in which your participation with our professional development has shifted your approach to science education and why. The other kind of question is a closed question, and I'll give an example on the next page. This is where you require the person to choose from a predetermined set of points. With closed questions, you can do quantitative numerical data analysis, but they tend to have less depth of meaning. This is an example of a closed question set. So you've got a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and a set of questions. I've shifted my practice due to interaction with this PD. I appreciate the presence of the PD in my school, etc. And a series of numbers that participants circle. Note that there's a neutral. Sometimes you want to have a neutral, sometimes you don't. So you have to really think about that. This is another kind of Likert scale, and if you like this, you're certainly welcome to use this kind of scale. This is an instrument I created for trying to understand teacher beliefs and how much they overlapped with the philosophies of the work, the professional development work that I've been doing. So you can see here where they say they can circle whether things are completely separate or completely overlapped. You can also do frequency scales. So you can ask, do you ever, never, to always do a frequency, do something. You can also ask, do you do it once a month, 2 to 3 times a month, etc. And this can be really helpful when looking at behaviors. Behaviors can include things like instructional practices. This can be a problem. You have to be very, very careful. So for example, this example that I used, this is one of my surveys on science instructional practices. It worked for middle school teachers who had a dedicated science classroom to talk about whether they generated questions or predictions to explore never, sometimes, often, daily. But for elementary teachers, there was a huge problem because they may not teach science daily. So this scale is problematic if they don't teach science daily. It needs to be recalibrated. So really think about who exactly is taking a survey when you come up with these. You may also ask for specific numerical responses. So as an example, I can ask, please tell us the professional development you received in the last 2 years by subject. How many hours have you received over 2 years? And so the person can write down the hours for math, language arts, science, etc. Okay, and note that I'm very, very specific here. Not just how many hours of professional development you received, but how many hours over 2 years. And I try to really bold that so that they understand exactly what is being asked. You can also ask participants to rank something. So out of these 3 barriers to bilingual education, rank them 1, 2, 3. What is the biggest barrier? So finish going over specific questions and the shortcomings of each type and some of the mistakes that can be made. I want to give a couple little bits of final advice. Number 1, if the questions are sensitive, increase ways for people to find anonymity. So for example, if you asked for income level, don't just ask them to give their income in a line. Give them ranges. So income from $10,000 a year to $30,000 a year, or $31,000 to $50,000. That way they can hide in the anonymity of that income bracket. And also, very importantly, this is probably one of the most important things I'm going to say in this video. If you are trying to measure a construct with a Likert scale, you will need several Likert scale questions that you then average together into that one construct. So if it's something like teacher, so back to the teacher's needs for teaching bilingual education. If you're examining their beliefs about students, about bilingual students, whether they believe bilingual students are able to learn English, for example, you would need at least 3 questions that kind of got at different aspects of that idea that then you would average together. That lends strength to your analysis. Whereas just one question, it doesn't necessarily target the fullness of that idea. And you'll see that if you start reading survey research. This is an example of 3 items per construct. These are constructs examining whether a professional development was effective. So one construct is the extent to which the professional development incorporated content. And you can see here that they are asked about pedagogical content, adapting teaching to meet NGSS, and strategies for teaching diverse students. And here's the Likert scales. So essentially, to get the final number for this idea of content in PD, we would be averaging across. For active learning, same thing. We actually have 5 aspects of active learning, and you can see how these are each different aspects of active learning. Except direct instruction is reverse scored, but participating in student work evaluation, smaller whole group discussion, individual collaborative problem solving. So we average across all of those to get an idea of exactly to what extent people engage in active learning. Now I'd like to advise you to pause here. In the last slides that I just did, I went over a bunch of different ways to create survey questions. You should hopefully have been jotting down a lot of different ideas. Now go draft a short survey. Write down all the ideas that you have for your main topics, if you remember that topic brainstorm. So you'll want at least 1 question per topic. But if they're Likert scales, you should probably have 3 or so to try to angle in onto that topic. Sometimes going to the literature really helps to understand that topic. And of course, like I mentioned in the very beginning, talking to the actual people you'll be surveying, whether it's a focus group or just a quick conversation, may also help. Then come back and go through the rest of the video to check up on any flaws that may be within your questions. The rest of the video goes over what might be things that happen in questions that don't work very well for getting good data. Beware questions that are unanswerable because the respondent doesn't actually know the answer. Like, what was your parents' exact annual income 2 years ago? And beware of questions that are leading or loaded. These are actually fairly easy to do when we're really passionately committed to social justice. We really kind of want to allow for answers that don't necessarily confirm our original ideas. So this is another political example here. Bad questions can also be double-barreled. They ask the respondent to think about 2 things at once. So for example, to what extent do you believe that professional development and professional learning communities are important? They may feel that professional learning communities are important, but professional development is not important. So this question confounds what we're able to understand. Other ways in which you can create a question that doesn't work very well is using terms for which the definition can vary. So you don't really know the definition that the respondent has in their head. So an example of the question I've struggled with in one of my surveys is, to what extent do you provide opportunities for students to engage in modeling? Well, what the heck does modeling mean, right? It's a really difficult concept, and the teacher may not know exactly what I mean by that term. You also want to be clear about not being ambiguous about the time period or the class the respondent should consider. So I always ask my respondents to think about one particular period or one class or in the last 2 years. And finally, sometimes the instructions are not clear. Do you want them to check 1 answer, 2, more than 1, 5? So be very clear about instructions. Finally, there may be some social justice considerations. Really think about, does your question imply a deficit view of the respondent or of anyone else? It's very easy when asking questions of people who have less power to imply in those questions that they may not be as worthy of respect or that they may do something wrong. Think about how the data collection process respects their privacy, their identity, and their agency. And also, think about whether the data is ultimately used to empower or increase equity and social justice. And this includes things like teachers or principals or anyone else we might survey for that matter. Even people in positions of leadership have to have their privacy, identity, and agency protected. And it's important that we don't take a deficit view of them either, even if we're hoping to support them in taking a more equity-based or social justice approach to their own students. Finally, let's return to the question I asked you to think about at the very beginning. What do you think the issues are with this question now that you have heard about all the different potential problems of questions? How has your attitude/motivation to read for pleasure been affected by having independent reading provided during school time this semester? So, one thing that might have caught your eye is this thing right here. This is two different ideas, attitude and motivation. Attitude towards what? Motivation. The motivation to read for pleasure, that makes sense. Attitude may be a slightly different construct. I like the specificity in this question, affected by having independent reading provided during school time. So they're saying, look, here's this one thing that happened, independent reading during school time. This semester, there's even specificity in timing. So that's good. Now, greatly affected, somewhat affected, etc. I'm not sure about that as a Likert scale. I might phrase it somewhat differently because by the time they reach here, they're like, what's greatly affected? So those are some kinds of things to think about in a survey like this. Now, I hope this video supported you in coming up with some ideas for some survey questions. In terms of bringing a survey draft to class on the 6th. Now, that is not to say that you may not find a survey instrument in the literature that meets the needs that you are looking for. I recommend if you do that, you go through the exact same process as we looked at here. You look at each of the questions, you make sure that they actually address your topic, and you make sure that they don't have any of the flaws recorded here, because even published survey instruments can have such flaws. I look forward to seeing your survey instrument.